If a plane crashed in this bay here, and say 350 odd people on the plane died, it'd be world news. If two planes crashed, say another plane came across the next day and crashed in the same position out here, you know, it wouldn't just be world news, you'd have reporters from all around the world heading here. Then what happened the next day if another plane crashed? Then another one, day after day out here. You know, it'd be absolutely incredible. You know, the publicity around the world, it would never stop. All these planes crashing in the same place. We've had 14 plane crashes out here, the amount of dead bodies. And a lot of those planes have a lot of children, you know. That's the reality, to lose all those people out here and no one says nothing. And we should know better in Europe. You know, we went through the Second World War, yeah? And still the repercussions of that are still going on today. Yeah? And the governments here are doing it again. Yeah? It's just astounding, you know. And in the Second World War, a lot of the governments didn't know what was going on because it was hidden. Everyone knows what's going on here. Everyone. It's been all over world news, you know.
Actually, before the war, Syria is a safety country. Anyone who moved from his homeland is, of course, he will remember the best things. And so it was safe, it was okay, but as I told you, it's just injustice. It's a not easy decision. It's not just my 5 years working there. I studied also a lot of years there. I have all my memories there. I have also my father job, my grandfather. I have history. But I have to move and leave everything. It's not an easy decision at all. It's not easy to left your house, you left your land, you left everything. So I try to stay as I can. First thing, I lost my job. I was a teacher. Then I moved to my town. Then a big battle happened there. From 2011, 2012, and the first quarter of 2013, we used to hide, like in basement, in a house with 2 floors. But with that battle, you can't really, because the bombs, what they used, it's a very huge bombs, and it could destroy a building with 3 floors, just like that. So people after this battle started, in 3-5 days, people have been completely moved to the town, and the population is at 25,000 people. So they moved, and they distributed now around the world. I worked hard, I worked really hard. I was studying, working, get married, I have parents, I have to look after them, sisters. And then you find yourself, you have to move.
The term refugee strictly is defined by the Refugee Convention, the UN Convention 1951, and it's someone who is outside the country of their nationality or what's called their habitual residence, and it has what's called a well-founded fear of persecution for one of 5 reasons. And they have to be able to demonstrate that protection is not available to them in their own country, and therefore they're in need of international protection.
I listened to an incredible woman called Eva Schloss. She's the stepsister of Anne Frank, herself a survivor of the Holocaust, drawing the parallels between the EU and Europe's response to this refugee crisis and the response in the 1930s to the Jewish refugee crisis.
I think we make exactly the same mistake. They are not treated as human beings, they are not welcome, and everybody besides Germany is trying not to take any in at all. But people should really realize that those are people who need definitely be helped.
You know, that crisis, the Second World War, the Holocaust itself, that history is what the EU grew from. It's also what the whole body of international human rights law grew from. A response to those atrocities. They said we won't allow this to happen again. But we are allowing much of that to happen again.
Culture of disbelief is essentially that you start from the assumption that someone's lying and they have to prove that they're not.
The majority that are coming are economic migrants. In addition, we see, as I warned earlier, evidence that ISIS are now using this route to put their jihadists on European soil. We must be mad to take this risk with the cohesion of our societies.
If you want to understand everything that's wrong with Europe's response to this crisis, it's how Europe has framed it. And the problem is Europe has never seen this as a humanitarian crisis. Rather, it sees it as a crisis for Europe. And the crisis for Europe is all of these people trying to come here. All of these people who are not us.
They're pouring into Europe by sea.
The tide of illegal immigrants.
Human wave, a human tidal wave. Flood, tide, swarm, scream, stampede, overwhelmed.
So people have taken to boats, not because they're stupid, not because they don't know better, but because they have no other choice. And the reason they're having to do that is because it has been consistent policy on the part of the EU to raise high walls and shut its borders.
I recently took part in a Holocaust memorial event and was given a reading about two Jewish ships, one which went down off the coast of Turkey and the other which was turned back from the US. And people eventually ended up back in EU and most of them dead, and that was drawing the parallels with what's happening in the Mediterranean now.
These are the war people, they need looking after. They're war refugees coming out of a war zone. When they cross the border into Turkey, they should be registered. Then they should be allowed to go to what country would like to take them. Yeah? They should be flown out, not risking their lives and spending all their money.
I gave him $1,100 US dollars to become here.
About 80% of the refugees are men of fighting age.
Islamic State fighters could appear
people
among
who
the
sympathize with
which means there
militant
could be
Islam.
bad guys in there
terrorists.
with the good guys.
It's men. There aren't that many women, relatively speaking.
What can sometimes happen is that men come first before the women and children in the hope of finding a place, if they do have family, who can join them later. Others are single men, sometimes quite young. And what a family sometimes does if they're in trouble is, let's one of us be safe. Let's one of us go, see if we can find not just a place of safety, but a place to work.
But the notion that somehow concerns around security can be used to bar hundreds of thousands of people who clearly are entitled to protection is a nonsense, it's crap.
About extremist point, people who are scared from extremist point, I agree with them, but it's a ratio. It's the 0.0005. What about the rest?
But the majority who are now coming, about 60%, are women and children.
We accommodate vulnerable refugees. That means elderly people, women traveling alone, pregnant and lactating women, families with children under 8 years old, people with disabilities, and sick and recovering people.
The reality is, Islamic State or any other entity that wants to carry out terrorism in Europe can do so without sending people in as refugees.
I want to appeal to all potential illegal economic migrants, wherever you are from. Do not come to Europe.
The lifeboat is full. We are going to tip over. It is an unsustainable situation.
The notion that the EU can't afford to respond appropriately and in line with both international and European law to this crisis is a nonsense. The problem is not that Europe can't afford in material terms to respond to it, it's that Europe isn't inclined to respond to it, and that at the political level we've actually seen a number of leaders across Europe use the issue to stoke up unrest and division. We've seen an awful lot of scapegoating, we've seen an awful lot of pretty hateful rhetoric.
But the vast majority of people who come want to make a contribution and rebuild their lives and not have it done for them. They do not want to be seen as victims.
Well, I mean, I remember talking to a woman in a settlement in Lebanon and asking her did she want to go to Europe, and she got quite angry. She had a newborn baby in her arms and she went, "Why should I have to go to Europe? I don't want to go to Europe. I want to go home."
They'll go to a country where they believe there's a possibility of re-establishing themselves, and that isn't done necessarily by having a nice reception centre. It's what comes after that.
I think that their purpose is just to survive, and after gaining the survival level, well, to live as we do.
They want to work, they don't want to live off benefits, they want jobs, they want a safe way of life.
When Germany did open its doors and took about 1 million in 2015, it wasn't being purely altruistic. It was because it knew it had an ageing population and on the whole a highly qualified group of people who were willing to enter and come and add to the workforce.
You know, we're completely overstretched by this. You've got a 30% rise in rough sleepers on the streets of Britain every single year. You've got a chronic housing shortage, just like Sweden, and yet they keep bringing these people in.
The homelessness crisis here in Ireland is a real crisis. It's costing lives, it's causing incredible hardship for people. It must be addressed.
We could deal with the homeless situation. We could be building social housing. We could ensure that the wealth that does exist in the country is more evenly spread so that people get the health care they need.
But it's not an either or. It never has been.
And it does call into question what the EU is about. If it came about in order to avoid another world war, like we saw, the one that ended in 1945, then what the hell do we think we're doing?
But in the same different side, I hope also people understand that immigrants or asylum seekers, they are forced to live their life. You know, like many Irish people now, they travel abroad and they are not under enforced, you know? Many of them, they have been that. Maybe the Irish people in their history in 1840, maybe in famine, they moved because enforced by some reason. But now, many people moved with no reason, you know? So, with no reason, people moved. You can imagine people would have all these reasons. I'm just trying to explain because many people, they didn't know what's going on.
It's been a very long time, even though it is part of our history, since people had to flee Ireland because of either persecution or famine. But that is part of our history.
Irish people in particular should have an exceptional resonance with people needing to go elsewhere, take their culture and enjoy it and be received. And I think that's something we need to keep remembering.
Well, Eileen, the big idea for the European Union in getting to grips with this crisis has been to co-opt Turkey to stem the flow of refugees crossing to Greece.
I don't think we've ever seen such an all-out assault on refugee law. And that's really come to a head, I suppose, in the last number of months when we look at the EU-Turkey deal that we've seen. If the EU provided humanitarian visas, safe and legal routes, effective resettlement programs for conflict zones and the countries that surround conflict zones, there wouldn't be a market for people smugglers. The EU created it. Turkey was doing relatively well. There were problems, but it was doing relatively well. It's not now. We've seen Fortress Europe extended into Turkey. We now have Fortress Turkey.
So it was a sort of quid pro quo where we'll get rid of our problem of the people and we'll open things up a little bit for you.
Follow us. We are picking up some speed. Over.
I mean, you have to remember, this is an EU whose member states in early 2015 were refusing to put in place humanitarian search and rescue missions because they were worried that it would be a pull factor.
There will be no longer an incentive for Syrians to pay criminals to smuggle them across the Aegean. Doing so will not only land you back in Turkey, but will put you on the bottom of the list for resettlement.
The EU-Turkey deal is human trading. You're having complete disregard for the humanity of the people that have come, many of them from very desperate situations.
And our response to that is not good enough. When they get to Europe, they were being met, as I said, by baton charges, by tear gas, by water cannon. Now we're locking them up. Now in Greece, we have kids behind bars. Kids fleeing that kind of persecution, and we have them behind bars. That's not who we're meant to be.
نوصل على ألمانيا نروح عند أهلنا بس إيش هالشوب مثل السجن طلع تقول حيوانة.
Well, the lady won't focus so much on Syria, but more on Europe.
And even the more conservative organisations like the UNHCR have pulled out of those camps because it's beyond the pale for them, and they're usually the last to do that. So that's a clear indication that something has gone on which is wrong.
Collective expulsion of foreigners is prohibited under the European Convention of Human Rights, so an agreement that would be tantamount to a blanket return of any foreigners to a third country is not consistent with European law, is not consistent with international law.
What days?
When did she arrive?
It's been 31 days.
It's a very bad situation there.
This is my child. You can see others
Please elaborate on the fact that these camps used to be open camps and now detention centers where actually there are food shortages. Food shortages and children, babies not getting the baby milk they actually need. This is in the European Union, this is people detained with not enough food. Come on!
Out of sight is out of mind, and therefore it's easy for people to, unless they go looking for that type of evidence, to pretend it isn't happening.
The migration deal between the EU and Turkey is illegal, according to Amnesty International. In a report published today, the NGO criticises the conditions in which refugees are held in Turkey, as well as the treatment of asylum seekers.
Which means that the irregular flow of migrants along the Western Balkan route have now come to an end.
What we're going to see now instead is a significant increase in the number of people crossing from Libya. The one thing that is, I think, completely predictable, though, is that the EU's current approach isn't working. And their refusal to accept that simple fact is deeply worrying.
It is trading in people in a way that should never be tolerated, and what it will lead to, we simply don't know.
The greatest garden have a greatest gardener. People coming here because they force somebody, some reasons, force them to come here. If they integrate easily, they will be really helpful. But if they don't, here is the challenge. So integration is not just the government responsible, it's a culture responsible. So every time you help them to integrate, they will be very helpful because they're coming with high education, they're coming with different skills, they're coming with different background, they can add new things to the culture and they can improve it
ordinary people from across Ireland and from across the EU who are travelling out to Lesbos, who are travelling to Greece, who are going to Calais, who are going to Dunkirk, who see the human reality of what's happening there, are disgusted and outraged by it. They're a huge part of the solution here. But what we have to do collectively is amplify that outrage and make sure that our political leaders have to listen.
Yeah, the volunteers see a lot, and it is a big concern. You know, when they go home, people don't understand them. They don't understand what they've been through. And a lot of them come back. A lot of them have sold their houses. A lot of them have handed their jobs in. A lot of them have rented their houses out, and they've just come back just to help. You know, they've seen so much, and it's got to them, and it changed their life forever.
There is something extraordinary and unprecedented about that kind of response. It's enormously encouraging. I mean, it's heartbreakingly encouraging at times to see how ordinary people respond. But I think it's also really worrying, because it demonstrates just the abject failure of a system of politics and law that's meant to respond. This is why we organised as states, as communities. This is why we organised as a union. So we'd be better able to deal with exactly these kinds of crises and catastrophes.
Everyone out here cries, everyone cries. You know, I've seen war cameramen, war correspondents crying their eyes out here with some of the things, the suffering going on.
And actually, there are strong movements across Europe of ordinary people who are not happy that this is being done in their name. We need to start to remind the EU why it exists in the first place. It doesn't exist to protect large corporations, big business, political power blocks. It's meant to be a union of states who stand in solidarity. The only way that things change is when ordinary people demand that they change. I mean, real progress, real change to any human rights crisis or catastrophe, to any major social justice issue, comes from the level of the street, it comes from ordinary people.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
Bernadette Devlin was later to comment that at some time in a country's history, there are enough people who feel the same way at the same time to create a force and change the pattern of events.
We are here to ask, and we're here to ask vehemently, where are the leaders of our country? Where is the leadership?
Before this strike began last July, the people on this picket knew very little about South Africa or apartheid. Their 8 months on the street have made them much more aware of the cause they've taken such a strong stand on.
Earlier this evening, the Communist Central Committee in East Berlin proposed an action program, including free elections and a democratic coalition government. Tonight, citizens from both Germanys are singing and dancing on the wall itself, reunited right on top of that harsh symbol of division.
The history of progress is a history of struggle, of conflict between those that have that wealthy elite and those that don't.
So, and we brought all the boats in that, and we were looking after the children, and it was the sea was fairly rough. And I was just talking to one big family, and they're all telling me their names and everything, and this guy come and tapped me on the shoulder, and I said, "You okay?" And he said, "Yeah." He said, "I have something for you," and he put his hands inside his jumper and pulled out this big dustbin liner like this, and full of tape and everything, and he's unwrapping it like this, and I'm looking at him, and he pulls out this stone, and he said, "This is from my home country. This is from Palestine. 5 months ago I picked it up and I put it next to my heart for someone special." And he gave it to me. That finished me.